Hi, welcome to Jeremy Pryor's podcast, or what I like to call Jeremy Pryor Unfiltered. I'm his daughter and producer, Kelsey, and we are excited to bring you seasons of content all the way from Tolkien to theology, from business to family. If you like to contemplate deep philosophical ideas across a wide range of topics, you've come to the right place. Make sure you give us a follow so you don't miss out on future episodes.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the podcast. I'm here with some of my kiddos. Kelsey Gall is in the house. Elisa Hope. There she is. Jackson Pryor is without a video today. What's up, Jackson?
Hey, guys.
And then Sydney Grace.
Hello.
Up in the attic. Awesome. Welcome, guys. So, all right, this is the place where I like to inflict videos and topics that I'm thinking through on my children and process them and see what we come up with. All right, so there's a bunch of videos I want to share with you guys, and then one topic that if we have time we'll hit. So this guy Carl Benjamin, who's really fascinating kind of internet figure. He came out as this. He was actually anonymous for a while. His name was Sargon of Akkad. I have no idea why he used that name. But for a long time, he was ravaging the internet with his ideas on YouTube under that pseudonym, and nobody knew who he was. And then he popped out behind the veil, and his name is, I think, Carl Benjamin. Anyway, he's one of the most articulate kind of describers of the root reason why liberalism fails. And he was having a conversation on a podcast, and I was like, man, he's saying things I don't know if I've ever heard anybody articulate it this way. So I wanted to play with you guys a couple of clips and just get your reactions to what he's saying here. So he's just, first of all, he's kind of telling his story. He started as pretty left wing, and then he was concerned about where it was headed and has kind of changed his philosophy. He's going to describe a little bit more about his personal story. Here we go.
It has some nice ideas in the left, sort of share the wealth.
Wealth is always shared. Like, that's not their idea. Like kings used to literally give out money after looting a city to their nobles to keep the nobles happy. Like,
but did the nobles then give it to the peasants?
They've got no choice. They've got to pay the peasants for the labor. Like, otherwise they won't do it. So wealth has always circulated. Like, this isn't some sort of new innovation that the left have come up with. The left's innovation is to make it so that we all have the same wealth. They want us to all ultimately be the same. And that's actually a really evil prospect, if you think about it, because that means that someone who does no work at all is entitled to exactly what I have, exactly what you have, which is not fair.
See, I like Hanlon's razor, and maybe to the point of being naive, but I'm just sticking to it. The idea that it's not necessarily out of evil, but maybe stupidity. I mean, you said yourself you were quite left-wing.
It's not even evil. It is evil, but it's not that the people are evil. It's that they think this sounds like a nice ideal.
Yes.
It's not a nice ideal, actually. It's actually the end of what they claim to be to most value, which is diversity. Diversity comes from inequality, because equality means sameness. And if we're all the same, then there is no diversity. And this is the problem with liberalism. It is a great homogenizing force that seeks to turn everything into the same thing. And they don't know when to stop.
What do we do then with the idea that there's 8 billion people on the planet, there's a whole bunch in the UK, some were born like in a bin, and I went to private school and had a nice life. Mm-hmm. And we don't want equity, because that's just ridiculous. But what do we do? Do we just go, well, that's your lot?
Well, I think that the most important thing for people is to feel that they're being treated fairly. Mm-hmm. Right? That's because as soon as we get off of ideological language like equity, equality, liberty, all this sort of stuff, and say, okay, but on the basis of how we feel about these things, am I being treated fairly? And so there was an example, I think it was in Cheshire, of a young chap who had looked his entire life to join the police force, and so he'd got the right qualifications, he'd done the right training, and they denied him on the fact that he was a white man, and he sued them successfully over that.
Brilliant.
Right?
So I want to stop this clip. There's 2 more I want to share with you guys. But his first kind of critique there, which I think is so important to say, is that I really think that it's the it's the responsibility of the government to make sure that people to ensure justice, and that is that we all are equal before the law, and that it's not the job of the government to attempt to balance the scales, and that's not the same as justice. There's nothing justice about that. That actually is sort of a perversion of the idea of justice. Justice is when I have a dispute with somebody and I need to this needs to be adjudicated. Are we treated fairly? That is critical. But what's really ironic is that the government is now stepping in and committing a series of injustices against its citizens in order to ensure justice, right? Their version of justice. And so I'm curious what this, kind of gives this example of, it all comes from this idea that, okay, there's the government has a need to enforce equality or equity. And, one of his critiques there is that it actually destroys diversity. Like, you can't, if you start to do this, if you start to enforce that we're all going to have the same outcome, regardless of what we actually do, then you're going to destroy the diversity that's created by all the different things that we ought to be free to pursue, and that the government needs to stay out of that whole. That's just the realm of freedom that it needs to provide for its citizens, and the only time for the government to get involved to rectify an injustice is when there's something unfair happening between two parties, essentially, that need to be adjudicated. Any thoughts about, I think that's a really interesting description of really the problem of liberalism.
Well, I think it's wild that those are two things that they claim to uphold. Like, the two of their biggest values are equality and diversity. But for him to say you cannot have diversity if you have equality, I haven't heard anyone say that, but it makes total sense. Like, if everyone is the same, how can you be diverse?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the difference is the fairness. I think that was really great for him to say. You're right. He's very articulate and he says the right things for this kind of issue. Especially when he started off with saying that wealth has always been the way that it has been. Like, the rich people get it, and then they pay the poor people for labor. And that's how it works. That's how it has always worked. And that's been fair, not equal. And so if you're going for equality, it's eventually going to come full circle. I've heard this criticized about the left party a lot, is that they try so hard to get a certain place only to end up right back where they started.
Yeah.
And I think that's what happened with the communists, the socialists, and that's what they're trying to push now. And if they keep going down that rabbit hole, then they're going to end up right back where we started. And if you keep on pushing for equality and diversity at the same time, that's going to happen. So,
well, I always think about getting right back where we started is like, what if in 100 years they're pushing the same campaign, but for straight white people? Because after everything they've done, it's ended in total discrimination of straight white people or whatever the category you want to say. And so in 100 years, they're fighting the exact same fight, but for the opposite group, because they realize and it's just a cycle. I don't know.
Right. Well, it's interesting when he was describing how there's something evil about this, because a lot of what people call social justice, which are the kinds of laws or movements that would be enforced by the government to ensure that people begin to experience better equality because of maybe historic problems that have occurred. I really think that that's not necessarily justice. I think that's actually kindness. I think what's difficult is that you would see why it's evil for the government to enforce kindness, because the government can't enforce kindness. And so to actually enforce justice, you have to make very clear who the aggrieved party is, and who the, both sides of that, and then enforce a restitution. And I do think that there's lots of cases in which that needs to happen, and I think that is justice. But oftentimes these very broad scale movements to say, well, there's sort of a historically disadvantaged group, and so we're going to take a historically advantaged group and just start stealing from them and give it to the I think there is a need for kindness to those who are disadvantaged.
Have you ever considered starting a family business so you can spend more time working as a family team? We've started a year-long coaching program called Family Inc., where you get weekly coaching with Jeremy, access to our video training for launching family businesses, and lots of ideas for businesses to start that are working for other family teams. Head over to familyteams.com and click Family Inc. to learn more, or to set up a strategy call with Jeremy to see if this might be a good fit for you.
But I don't think it's not helpful to call it justice. I think that actually creates an evil, which is not difficult to perceive once you use the correct language. But it's the really co-opting of the word justice that confuses everybody so deeply. And I think that justice needs to be understood as equal before the law. In other words, when you stand before the law, you cannot advantage the rich or the poor, the advantaged or the disadvantaged, that you all are equal before the law, and that in that place, anyone could receive the same outcome based on not having anything to do with who they are intrinsically, but because of the laws themselves are equally applied to both parties. All right, I want to keep going because he has several other things to say, and I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are about this next clip here.
Against the person above you. So you would have this almost sort of spiritual theory of the rights of Englishmen that would be appealed to against someone who you felt was doing wrong to you. And this was well supported. It was something the English were very proud of. But when it comes to France, it's a very different beast. And so now it's the universal rights of all humanity. It's like, okay, that's very...
So he's going to describe kind of where this left-right thing occurred. I kind of wanted you guys to understand the history of this. Why is the left called the left? Why is the right called the right? What happened? And so what happened is there was a certain vision of justice that was being promoted in England. And he started by describing that, which, there wasn't at that time a left-right understanding of this basic divide. And then something different occurred in France, which is really the origin of kind of our current conception of the way that these two sort of political ideologies were formed.
Very different, because if you've got a particular and parochial view of rights that's centered and grounded in a historic continuum at a particular geographic location, that takes on a kind of homely, sort of natural...
So he's saying in England, they didn't have a universal idea of rights. They just had a parochial idea. In other words, there's like, this is the way that we as English people can perceive rights in general. But it's something that we know kind of flows out of our unique tradition and therefore applies to us uniquely. The French had a different vision. Theirs was a project of trying to understand a much more universal idea of human rights. And so once that sort of took over the world, this didn't become a question of tradition about like how do we generally see this in our country or with our set of values or our faith. This became like universal, and therefore we can enforce it everywhere and on everyone.
Perspective, especially as there was no one document that everyone agreed to. But in France, you instead have to simply reformat the country, and that's exactly what they did. They took a rationalist approach to reconstructing France. So they began at year zero. They reformatted all of the districts into roughly equal sizes. They decided that everyone has exactly the same rights, and it's like, okay, but nobody actually has exactly the same rights. Like, everyone's right to things is actually kind of different, actually. My right to my house is not your right to my house, and things like this. And so in the French Revolution, you see the seeds of what comes after it. You see the seeds of fascism in its excessive nationalistic tendencies. You see the seeds of communism in its excessive leveling tendencies. You see the seeds of liberalism in its desire.
So the idea that we've discovered the universal idea of human rights creates reactions and counter-reactions, which results in this right-left world of fascism and communism. It's a unique reaction to sort of this French ideology that emerged right after the French Revolution.
Desire to have a much more open and less stratified society. And what this does, though, is it renders all of the world as being basically immoral. And so now liberalism takes on a crusading aspect, right? We've got to change Germany, we've got to change Spain, we've got to change all of these things. And this is what we're seeing to this day. And so the question of left and right comes from the French Assembly. And the question of left and right, the reason these things are left and right is it was a question of, should the king have a veto over us? I can't remember what the topic was now, but it's actually kind of trivial. And should the king have a veto? And the people who didn't think so sat on the left, and the people who did think so sat on the right. And so basically this came to mean the forces of tradition versus the forces of progress.
That makes sense. So that's where we first saw this left-right divide. Was there sort of a traditionalist camp within France that wanted to give the traditional veto to the monarchy, and they sat on the right? And so the right became roughly associated with the sort of traditionalists, and those who wanted to sort of change society and believed that the world needs to be reformed because it's essentially immoral. They began to sit on the left.
And so liberalism was on the very vanguard of the forces of progress until it got to a certain point at which people felt roughly that this was where we should be. And then it kept going. And it kept going. And so now there are the people who you would say are classical liberals, like Margaret Thatcher. She's a very liberal figure. Right? You can't end up with the phrase, there's no such thing as society, without being an extremely doctrinaire liberal. And she was what we'd call a neoliberal now. Big fan of Hayek and various other Austrian school economists. Deeply liberal in the way that she constructs the world. But she is now a right-wing figure because liberalism has continued to go to the left.
I see.
The forces of progress have gone on. And so now we're far beyond that. So Margaret Thatcher is now a far-right figure. And it's like, that shows you how much further to the left things have gone. And now we're literally at the point where we only discuss minority issues. Like, we're not allowed to discuss majoritarian issues because that is some form of racism, that's some form of oppression. And one of the congenital things about liberalism is it seeks universal recognition. So if you have a group of people who are a majority and you have a group of people who are a minority, well, liberalism will always find the minority more legitimate than the majority because there will be a notable power imbalance, and this will cause a differential in recognition. And so the minority becomes essentially a locus of morality because it is oppressed, and the majority will become a locus of immorality because it's oppressed.
Okay, this I think is a really important point he's making. There's something within the ideology of liberalism that will always try to find a minority. And because they're a minority, they're always going to be disadvantaged because they have a less of a voice because they're a minority just by the nature of who they are. And because the whole idea of liberalism is equality, the only way that you can rectify that imbalance is to overrepresent the minority. And so once you accomplish that, then you that becomes normalized, and then you look for the next minority and the next minority, the next, and you get into smaller and smaller and smaller oppression groups in order to rectify these imbalances. And there is no way to stop the inevitable drift left is his larger
an
point.
Oppressor, because it restricts the amount of recognition that the minority can have. And if you're seeking equal recognition, well, the large group's always going to be bad. And so that's why in this country, all we ever talk about minority issues, and we can't talk about what the average English working family's concerns are. They're not represented anywhere.
Can't we say, if I believe I'm liberal, can't I say that when it was where it was 15 years ago, I'm also concerned about parroting what generations before me have said, back when I was younger.
Yeah.
You end up sort of saying these things and catching yourself and going, oh God. But back in the sort of early 2000s or whatever it was, where there was still enough room to make jokes that were like funny.
Yeah, this next point he's going to make, and I'll go ahead and skip over to it so you guys can see how he makes this point.
I just don't want to sort of dob him in it or whatever when he's not here to defend himself, but he seems to believe that this woke hierarchy of race or whatever, that oh, it's okay, but why aren't the Jews in it? And I'm going, well, isn't that like the litmus test?
Why do we want to be in it at all?
Well,
I'm not a Jew, but like, why would anyone want to be in it?
Well, it's the canary in the coal mine, isn't it? If there is one person who's just left out for no reason, then you go, or whatever reason, and you go, okay, this is actually bunk. Yeah. There's something wrong with this whole hierarchy. Yeah. We can't just say, oh, now we're in it, it's fine. And then all the sort of white people who are not Jewish don't get to have,
Yeah. How is that fair?
So can't we just say, this is what I want to get at? Like, I don't believe that where liberalism has gone is liberalism. Can you say that? Can you go, no, that's not liberalism anymore?
The thing is, it is liberalism. That's the problem.
Okay.
The problem is liberalism has a particular internal logic, and it operates.
So something very weird about liberalism that I feel like people have never been able to figure out, because it sounds so good. I mean, it sounds so good. There are people that are disadvantaged. Aren't you a kind person? Don't you have compassion and empathy for those people? And so it sucks in people. And he's about to explain why there's something hidden about the ideology that's inevitable that creates these problems.
It's along this logic dialectically. So you get the liberal and the illiberal position and liberalism, and that synthesize into the new liberal position, and then this continues on. And so because liberalism values, it makes two fundamental promises, which are liberty and equality, right? Liberty is actually quite an easy one to accomplish. Constitutional rights will solve the liberty problem. Equality is essentially an impossible problem to solve. And so if you have people who feel like they are marginalized, they will always be able to say, well, we're not equal, are we? And the liberal has to say, that's a good point, we're not equal. And they can always say, well, you did promise equality, didn't you? And the liberal say, yeah, I did promise that. And so the dialectic continues. Whatever they're arguing will get infused into liberalism as it is now, and so it will carry on. And this is why intersectionality, otherwise known as wokeism, has been so successful in conquering liberal thought, because it said, look, these people aren't getting recognition. That means they're not equal. That means you're lying. And every liberal says, well, hang on, I'm not a liar. And they say, well, the reason you do this is because you're a racist, or you're a sexist, you're a misogynist. And every liberal says, no, I'm not that. I believe in the abstract, undifferentiated, universal mass of humanity. What are you talking about? Which is literally the fundamental premise of liberalism. Obvious nonsense. And so they are now strong-armed in saying, yeah, well, we're going to have to give Black Lives Matter everything they want. We're going to have to give the trans people everything they want. We're going to have to give these people everything they want, because otherwise I'm a bad person if I don't recognize them. And that's why liberalism can't stand still.
Oh, my God. So what happens next? How does this keep going? Can it go further?
Of course it can. There's no limits to there are an irreducible number of categories that we could categorize on. And it will continue. And you already see the seeds of it, where you've got the LGBTQ, IA double plus, blah, 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 blah. All of these things that are getting tagged on are just smaller divisions of minority identity. And eventually almost everything will be on there. And so this, I don't think, has got any signs of stopping. And in fact, I think that if you go back to the philosophers who first invented this, part of it is a kind of Heideggerian constant destruction. Marcusean constant destruction, where the point is the reduction of what came before to the end point, where everyone has equal recognition.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Ian McGilchrist was saying that.
So, that his point that that this is that there's sort of like this inevitable drift that's going to occur. I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are, because I think he's unveiling that there's something innate in the promise, and I love my favorite thing about his framing is that liberal society promises two things: freedom and equality. Freedom is easy. Just pass the Bill of Rights and enforce it equal under the law, and you'll get freedom. So it's very possible to create. It's an incredibly amazing thing to give a society. Equality is impossible. And so what happens is you basically have this inevitable drift towards, and every time you attempt to create equality, it's an intractable problem. And so it pulls society into this endless, and then his description, like the LGBTQ, like this is actually a perfect like description of what occurs, which is you keep creating another letter for a different minority group, and you think they all have something in common, which is they're all underrepresented minorities. And then you find smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller versions of these underrepresented minorities. And then your entire movement that represents, almost half the country is trying to solve the problem of a minority that represents, 0.1%. And we're going to force the majority to bow the knee to these ever smaller, underrepresented minority groups in order to fulfill the promise of equality made by the society. That's his.
Well, what's funny to me about that is the plus at the end. It's kind of just like, and if you want to be in this group, you can be too.
Right.
It's like, it's not defined at all. Like by putting a plus at the end, it's like, whatever. It's like
Yes.
no longer a specific group of people. It's like, if you identify with this label, you can add yourself to this. But let me see if I get this straight. So he's saying like on the spectrum, like there was right and then there was left, and right far right stayed right here, but far left kept moving. And so what used to be the center is now right. And then what used to be old liberal is now right center. And like, is that basically what he's saying? Right. So like, okay.
And that's an inevitable feature of the liberal project, because the project itself is to create equality for everyone. And so basically in every generation, you're going to have more and more minority groups trying to cash in on the promise of equality. And so anybody who's on the left is going to have to basically do everything they can to fulfill that promise, which causes this to be an endless drift left. And you're just going further and further and further into smaller and smaller and smaller representative minority groups all the while. And he's saying, one of the things he's sort of, saying is like, look, the problem is there's still real issues that the majority has. Like there are huge problems, that the traditional society still has to face. And so the only way that you're creating this equality is you got to keep taking more and more away from sort of the traditional society. And so you then commit this endless list of injustices against the society in order to prop up the equality that these smaller and smaller groups are clamoring to receive. And so it creates, and this is the evil or the injustice that he's saying is inevitable with this kind of a drift.
Yeah, and I see that in what you were saying earlier with the overrepresentation of minority groups. I see that in the way that the left argues. Like if you argue against abortion, and they'll always bring up the very small minority of women who get abortions who medically need them. Like, oh, you want to just like let women die who need abortions? And it's like, that is a very small percentage of the people who need abortions. And they also talk about intersex when talking about like transism, which is such a different problem than gender dysphoria. And so it's so odd that they feel a big need to bring up the minority every time you want to argue against the majority, because that's just their mindset. Yeah, it seems so backwards that like the statistics now are all like leaning towards the minority when it will affect the greater population. And it seems like a never-ending problem because there's always going to be somebody that is offended. Like that, like the little plus in that, who's like, oh, we don't want to leave anybody out because we're just going to keep adding letters and keep it. So nobody's offended, nobody's left out. And it seems like a never-ending problem of like trying to make sure everybody's included in this small group.
Right.
Are you following us on Facebook and Instagram yet? Look up @Family Teams to get even more free content and never miss out on event announcements.
Yeah. I think one way to, resolve this is you have to have a really clear articulation of the limits of what a government's responsible. And so you have to say the government is not responsible for making sure that minority interests are, we may have to make sure that everyone is equal before the law. You got to create a very equal playing field. Then you have to let things play out. You can't throw all of your weight behind one group because they're likely to be underrepresented. That is, you have to let that group do its work to become represented in whatever way that they can, through the same fair means that every other group has to. Like you have to create a very equal playing field for every individual and for every group. But then you can't and I think that what's happened is the government will throw its weight only behind minority groups. And in England, this is causing such problems like he's describing. It's they're much more advanced in some of the issues they're dealing with, just with regards to the amount of the amount of problems that are being created, you know, on the majority, the people who are historically majority, because of immigration. A lot of the Brexit kind of debates and things like that have occurred in England have occurred because of this sense that it's a racist to represent the majority in any way. And that is such a powerful. You're a misogynist and you're a racist and you're a bigot if you ever fight for the rights of the majority. And you can feel that. Like if you hear somebody in some public forum take power and try to say, "Hey, we need to fight for the rights of traditional English people," it's like that immediately sounds racist. And I'm picturing right now in my mind a white male when you're saying that. How dare you? They have too much power already. And so you don't create this equal playing field where it is important to negotiate the different needs of each group, and to allow for that equality. But now that's become a racist thing to do. And that ideology is so strong now in many European countries and becoming very strong in our context that it becomes impossible to represent those groups. It becomes immoral and evil in the eyes of this ideology.
I mean,
Well,
I
I
that. Sorry.
I saw this video of this black girl at a college campus. Like I think it was a Ivy League school, some elite university, and she was saying how she worked hard her whole life to make sure she could get into like a good school. And then she was accepted and feels like she didn't deserve it because she was accepted for diversity. And I just it made me think like, man, that means that the like universities who are purposefully seeking minority groups and letting them enter without actually deserving it, the only people that serves to the only people that actually want that are people who are not willing to work hard to get there. And so like the people who are, oh, I got here, I'm in Harvard or I'm in wherever because, they let me in because I'm black or because I'm, trans or whatever. But then the people who actually worked hard are like, I don't want you to accept me just because of this. Like I worked hard to get here. And so like those are the people who should have gotten in without the whole DEI agenda. And they're like, it's like a disservice to them. So it's kind of crazy. Sorry.
That's what I was going to say. The same thing's happening with immigration nowadays, where immigrants who got in legally years ago and like worked hard for their green card and like all these things are so angry now with the new way that they're accepting immigrants over the border. I saw a crazy video of New York. Like there's a lot of people, I guess, coming in through New York, and they started arresting people for like after they come back from vacations or whatever, and they find squatters in their house. They started arresting people that own the house because the squatters should have taken over the house, therefore they have a right to it. And so that's been a thing that started happening in New York, and I was blown away. And like this video that I saw in particular, this lady was an immigrant that owned the house. She's like, there's squatters in my house. Like, can you please get them out? And they arrested her. And she's like, I'm being arrested on my own property. And like, she was an immigrant. And so that really painted the picture for me of how backwards this has all gotten.
Right. I think that this is why I find it so important to understand the roots of why that's happening. I have a friend of mine who's very strongly on the left, and he said to me once, I always will take the side of the oppressed. And I'm like, that's an interesting articulation, but that's perfectly what Carl Benjamin's describing, because basically what the trick is that the society has said that the minority is always the oppressed, and therefore always take the side of the minority. And there's a huge segment of our society that doesn't care about justice, freedom, but they care about equality from that perspective, and that minorities are always oppressed, so always take the side of a minority. And so you can't care about truth or justice or equality before the law when you're always saying that I will represent the minority. Well, it's so bizarre to know what happens when a society is convinced by that ideology. What actually starts occurring is this bizarre question of, like, you look at a situation like a squatter and you're asking yourself, okay, I have to determine which of these two groups of people is more the minority, because they're the ones who are morally virtuous in the situation, inherently by who they are. And man, that's so bizarre, right?
Thank you for listening to Jeremy Pryor's podcast. Make sure you hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any future content. Follow Jeremy on Twitter and Instagram, as well as his Substack blog, all linked in the description. See you next time.